Hello, my name is Rad Watkins, and I am the Executive Director of the Missoula Conservation District in Missoula, Montana. Today, we're going to be talking about managing your horse properties for land, water, and horse health. When you're managing a horse property, you need to realize that management starts with your goals. Some common goals in horse management include maximizing grazing or reducing the amount of hay that you have to buy, keeping your horse moving all day, both for their mental enrichment as well as their physical health, keeping your horse off of too much green grass. Many horses suffer from metabolic diseases, or people are worried about founder or laminitis. So keeping your horse off green grass can actually be a problem too. And then hopefully we all have environmental stewardship as part of our ethic in keeping horses. The Missoula Conservation District recently signed a memorandum of understanding with the Missoula Horse Council, which runs the Big Sky Horse Park, and the Missoula chapter of the Backcountry Horsemen, just to share resources and help agree to message an environmental ethic when it comes to horse keeping. And so that's a great thing that these three groups have come together to do that. And I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the cost sharing proposals or programs we have here in Missoula at the Missoula Conservation District, which does cover the whole county. And other conservation districts probably have similar programs. So I'm a horse owner, have managed land for horses in several different states. This is a picture of my horses in Wisconsin, and there's lots of problems with that picture. So it's a little embarrassing to be here, but live and learn. And one of my goals is always the 3 F's of horse happiness. And that's that a horse needs a friend, they need forage, and they need freedom. It kind of gets back to like what a horse has really evolved for in the wild, what kind of natural, if you will, relationships. And I know, horses aren't really in their natural environments in very many places. The Mustangs in North America are feral, even though horses evolved in North America, across the ice bridge, or across the land bridge rather, into Europe and Asia and Europe, and then went extinct here in North America, and then were reintroduced into now are more of a feral or naturalized species. But anyway, there's a lot we can learn from how horses interact in those wild environments. So those are some of my personal goals, along with some of the other ones that we saw, the 3 F's of horse happiness. So horses are natural grazers, and there's a lot of benefits to grazing. There's nutritional benefits. There's omega-3s that are in green grass. There's vitamin E, there's vitamin A. Those are antioxidants and good for reproduction, immunity, skeletal health, all those things. A lot of people who have their horses on good forage and plenty of natural pasture, good managed pasture, find that they don't need to feed a lot of additional calories as far as grains and pellets and those things that are probably a little more carbohydrate laden and sugar, carbohydrate, sugar, one and the same, filled with sugars and just not naturally what horses would eat, and certainly not in the volume that sometimes we feed them. So forage is also good for digestive health. It has lots of fiber. It's what horses have, again, evolved to eat most of the time. Joint health, it's really important for horses to be on pasture, to have that mobility, benefits the horse's health. Hoof health too. The hoof is a pump. Every time it lands on the ground, it opens a little bit, sucks a lot of blood down the leg when it comes off the ground, and 1,000 pounds is released from that foot. It pumps blood back up. So moving along around pastures is a healthy thing for a horse. I like this quote. This came from Allison over at the Broadwater County Extension Office, and in her piece called "The Science and the Art of Grazing Small Acreage," she says, when grazing management is done correctly, it can provide benefits to the land, including stimulating growth, removing dead plant material, reducing wildfire threat, increasing nutrient cycling, and increasing forage production. However, when land is overgrazed, it can lead to many issues, including the prevalence of weeds, increased use of herbicides, poor forage quality, lack of plant diversity, and reduced land value, and increased erosion, water runoff, and nutrient leaching. So that kind of gets at some of the things that we talk about when we talk about regenerative agriculture And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's basically the philosophy we follow here at the Missoula Conservation District, and that we help promote through things like our Western Montana Grazing and Agriculture Conference, and participating with some of our partners across the state and across the region. So here's a little slide that kind of shows what happens when a plant gets grazed. You can see when, and particularly we're talking about graminoids, grasses here, graminoids are grasses and sedges and grass-like plants. So when a grass gets grazed to 50%, the roots continue to grow and function naturally. And that's because the leaves of the plant are the solar panels. They're out there gaining that energy through photosynthesis. Sugars are made. Energy gets put down into the roots and stored. And those solar panels can be knocked back, and the roots can have enough energy to rebuild them. Once a plant gets down to about 70% grazed, you see that the roots are reduced really to provide the energy for the regrowth of the plant. So the biomass of the roots reduces greatly, and that actually has a lot to do with, or it can contribute a fringe benefit of carbon sequestration and just carbon in the soil and building up that organic layer in the soil. So when it's reduced, once in a while, that can actually be a good thing for the soil, but constantly you just have shallower roots. So natural function of the roots are compromised, when the plant begins to get 70% grazed, and half of the root mass stops growing for at least 17 days. When you get to 90% grazed, pretty short, you have low regrowth altogether because there's no energy left for those roots to rebuild all that, especially if it's continuously grazed down to that point. There's just no reserves left in the roots. So almost all photosynthesis is stopped for at least 17 days, and the plant really struggles to survive. So we see, again, 50% grazed, we still have rapid regrowth, healthier soils, more water retention because of all the roots that are in the water and their ability as organic matter to help store water and hold water. And then when we get down to the overgrazed, we see the low regrowth, the compromised soils, less water retention. So what is overgrazed? We have both warm and cold season grasses, a lot of cold season grasses here in Montana. But with a warm season grass, you don't want to have the horses on there after the plant gets 10 to 8 inches. And then for our cold season grass, if you can pull your horse off when it's 5 or 4 inches at the most, that's a good time to pull your horse off. And that's pretty extreme compared to what a lot of us are used to seeing in a paddock. So here's a couple slides. I borrowed this one's from University of Maryland Extension, and let's see, the other one is from the Alberta Riparian Habitat Management Project. And what I really want you to look at here is the amount of leaf mass that you see above the ground generally affects the amount below the ground. And some people say they mirror each other. I mean, I think you can see from these images, they don't quite mirror each other. But what's happening above the ground really reduces the roots. And that's because it pulls on those stored resources that are in the roots to regrow those solar panels, which are the blades of grass, the leaves of the grass. So, here's a good rule of thumb, minimally, and this would be, again, for cold season grasses. Cold season grasses, in case you don't know, are the ones that sort of start growing early in the spring and then go dormant during our dry, hot summers here in the West, and then come back in the fall. I let my lawn go dormant. You don't need to water it all through the summer. That's kind of a side note. That's your personal choice if you want to do that, but it comes right back in the fall and turns green again, and I don't have to worry about mowing it all summer. So it's a fringe benefit for me. I'm kind of a believer in the less inputs into my system also means less work and more time for me to drink lemonade on my porch. So minimally put your horses on when the grass is 8 inches tall for a cool season grass, and then pull them off when it gets down to 4 inches, and let that pasture rest and at least get up to 8 inches. 6 to 8 inches is what I've seen in the research, but I would say 8 inches is pretty much a minimum, and you could probably up it from there. So once you get above or maintain a base of 4 inches of grass, the grass and those solar panels can rejuvenate the plant much faster than if you get below 4 inches. So 4 inches and more equals 1.47 times, according to the research, more productive. So that means that your plant is almost 1.5 times as productive just by making sure it never gets below 4 inches. So what does that mean to you as someone taking care of horses? Well, that's like taking a 5-acre pasture and letting it become a 7.35 if you do the math accurately, but if you just want to round it up, I'd say 7.5-acre pasture. And you're doing that without adding any more land. So I'm not sure you out there, audience member, what land's going for around you, but how would you like to pick up a free 2.5 acres of pasture for every 5-acre pasture you have? And I was kind of curious, so I just went on Zillow and looked up a 2.5-acre lot in Missoula. This one's gets kind of steep, but vacant lot, mostly grass, 2.5 acres, currently listed for $350,000 here in Missoula County, up Miller Creek, a place where we do a lot of restoration and work with a lot of our producers. So across the United States, agencies often advocate 5 keys to pasture management, and this is usually extension offices. It all depends. Excuse me. It all depends on who you're working with. Extension could be really into regenerative agriculture, or they might fall back on the old pillars of sort of pasture management. So that's mowing, dragging, resting, which is always a good one, fertilizing and overseeding, and weed control. And these things aren't bad, but we're going to have a slightly different approach in our talk today. So, with that approach, you go out, you do some soil testing, you get your pasture fertilizer, you end up getting, all the specs of what your grass has. You might get a soil report. It's very number driven. Do this, if that, and then you buy these inputs and drag and then mow, and it's working with nature, but working with nature with a lot of supplementation and a lot of expense and time. So this is from NCAT. This quote, I just really liked it. It really kind of, there's actually 2 quotes I'm going to read to you from Lee here at NCAT. And it kind of captures what we're talking about when we talk about regenerative agriculture, and in this case, regenerative grazing. So soil fertility is an ecosystem concept that goes well beyond the simple discussion of soil samples, fertilizers, and nutrients needed to produce high yields. Regenerative grazing management and the inherent abilities of the living, healthy soil promote productive pastures and animals and provide sustainable lifestyles for the people who work the soil. And here you can see a porous soil with roots going through it. That's what we're looking for. I did just change the slide, so the quote changed, but the soil picture stayed the same. Another quote from Lee. Instead of a nutrient-based discussion, we will be looking at the relationship between grazing, soil ecology, and nutrient cycling. And we'll consider some of the soil management strategies farmers are adapting to enhance and sustain pasture productivity. So when we talk about sustainable, we're talking about more of a system that can continue on its own without a lot of exterior inputs. And so if you want, go ahead and look at the NCAT webpage, and Building Healthy Pasture Soils is a really great article that's posted there by Lee. Oops. So make sure I'm in the right place here. Healthy soil structure. So when you think about soils, you got to think about the structure of the soil. Really what we're looking for is a structure that's about 50% pore space. And then the other 50% is mineral particles. And that's, your sand, salts, or clays. And then there's organic matter mixed in there too. So it's about 50% solid material, 50% pore space, and then about 45% the sand, silt, and clay, and then about 5% organic. And that organic part is the part that really is going to feed our grasses or other things that we have in there, and other species, which is a good idea. And then the pore spaces is what holds the air and the water, right? Because a piece of sand, one little grain of sand, can't really hold water. But if there's holes in it, water can be stuck in between, or in between 2 pieces of sand, you can have capillary tension holding water up. So pore spaces hold your water and air, and they're both essential for root development, right? Because, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But keep in mind, we need healthy soil structures. So here's just some examples of pore spaces. I borrowed this slide from a friend at Montana Extension. Fine textured soils actually can have more total pore space, and coarse textured soils can have less pore space, but more micro, uh, sorry, um, micropores. And then this drawing down here is really what I wanted you to see. Water gets held in between these soil particles, and then there's air in there too. And here's that picture, this pie graph of the different allocations kind of within the soil. And then roots, help to keep porosity in the soil, and worms and other things that dig in the soil, that provides even more airways. And we're always worried about the risk of compaction to soils. What else is in the soil? Well, there's a rich variety of life underground, from microbes to large soil-dwelling organisms. These things form a living network that drives decomposition, which is essential. If you think about all the leaves that have grown over the years, millions of years, we could be buried under thousands of feet of leaves, if they weren't digested by something and decomposed. And that's what the biology in the soil does. And then that's a huge part of nutrient cycling. And preparing this talk, it was really hard not to go into a soil health talk and really talk about the nematodes and all that stuff. But decided to stick kind of just a little bit about soil health because it really pertains to what we're talking about here. And just want you to know that there is a lot of biology in the soil. Just 1 teaspoon of healthy soil can contain billions of microorganisms, including bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and other tiny life forms. In a single handful of soil, the number of organisms can exceed the entire human population. And these healthy soils are essential for vigorous forage and improved grass production, as we know. Here's a slide I borrowed from the equine permaculture page. It just shows that surface litter at the very top. That's where things are decomposing, and where I said if it wasn't digested by the microbial community and the larger non-microbial community that live in the soil, we would be buried alive in duff. Then you have your topsoil horizon, where sort of the organic matter is. That's that A horizon, is what we often call it. So that's really where the nutrient exchange is happening, and the plant is getting most of its nutrients. And then you get into subsoil horizons and potentially bedrock, depending on where you live. So there's a lot going on in those soil communities. So, boy, I'll say recently, and I mean recently in the history of agriculture, but perhaps what was old is new again. We are talking about the principles of managing for soil health. And I borrowed this slide from NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is USDA. They're in charge of taking that Farm Bill money out and helping to feed the country and also protect our resources. Both conservation districts and NRCS came out of the Dust Bowl. The Missoula Conservation District's been in existence for 79 years this year, which is 2025. So anyway, things are evolving. So what we're finding with soil health is it's really important to minimize disturbance. And we can talk more about what disturbance is, but disturbance could be tilling, for sure. When you till up a whole pasture and start over and expose all those microbial community, all those microbes, to the sun, ultraviolet light, and the oxygen and the amount that's in our air. They're not evolved for that. So that can really kill that community, which is so important for the nutrient cycling, which is where you end up getting this sustainable regenerative fertilizer by managing the system when you work with the system. We're also finding that maximizing diversity of plant species, because they have relationships that feed that community under the soil too. So diversity is good. Also, sometimes people change the type of livestock, and that's, as horse owners, you may or may not have that opportunity. I had goats for a long time with my horses. Some people have a cow. Cows they may put on horse pasture after a while because they graze differently. We'll talk about that. But also maximizing that soil cover. So we're going to talk about grass length. But one thing I've noticed, when you look around your community, all the grass you see in public spaces and people's lawns is really overgrazed. So it's not our fault that we look at a horse pasture and think it's not overgrazed, because we're knocking our lawns back below 4 inches all the time. Well, one thing I've noticed at my house, and this is supported by research, um, I just did a no-mow May. So the grass was pretty long by the time I had to mow it. Um, and then I really didn't mow much in the fall either. And compared to my neighbors who mowed frequently, my grass stayed greener without water because covering the soil keeps the temperature down, keeps it from drying out. It 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 also keeps the water from evaporating as quickly, just being exposed to the sun and the wind. So maximizing soil cover is really important for that microbial community, and again, just everything that's living in the soil. And then maximizing the living root. And we talked already about how when you overgraze something, you knock back that living root quite a bit, and it changes the community under the soil as well. So these are the 4 principles of soil health. I've seen as many as 6 principles of soil health, but these are the 4 basic ones. So one of the things too, and this is a slide borrowed from the Global Soil Partnership, um, and this just talks about or shows the effects of compaction. We talked about how important those pore spaces are. They're important for roots to be able to get in there. They're important for holding air and water. But when we graze excessively, when we remove all deep-rooted plants that help aerate the soil, when we use heavy equipment on our soil, it can compact the soil, and that really reduces the pore surface structure. It makes it harder for water to, one, drain into the soil. I mean, you can almost create an impermeable or impenetrable layer of soil, depending on your soil type. Or certainly the water holding capacity is reduced when all those pore spaces are reduced, and not to mention the biodiversity of the soil. So here's a little example. I'm sorry, I don't know where I borrowed this slide from, or I would credit them, but it was a nice slide had around for a while that shows porous soils and how the plant can get through, and then even start to work below that A horizon potentially. And then on the other side, we see a compacted soil, but the plant manages to get through. You know, the seed is germinating in the tightly packed crumbs of the soil, but still can do it. But then as you get into the subsoil compaction, you know, it's really it makes it a lot harder for the plant. You can also have water suspended on those pans of compacted soil there below, and that can actually drown out the root. So too much water can be a bad thing too. So let's talk about grazing options with your horse. What are you going to do with your horse now that you know you need to keep your lawn, your pasture at least 4 inches long, and probably longer than that because the horse is going to eat some. So you got to get it, you know, up to 8 inches plus before you put the horse in there. So what are different management strategies for grazing management? So one is continuous grazing. You know, all you need there is a boundary fence. In this system, the horse is unrestricted and it has access to the entire pasture 24/7. It's simple, but it can lead to overgrazing and underutilization. So potentially the horses eat all the grass in one place, and maybe they have a toilet area, they're pooping somewhere and they don't like that, or maybe there's a plant that they don't find quite as desirable, and since they have the whole pasture to pick from, they avoid those plants. That could be a weed that then can propagate because it's not being knocked back by the horses naturally. So in this system, you know, those 5 principles that you hear preached a lot traditionally about pasture management would apply. You know, you'd want to take your soil test and probably have to give the soil something back because you're going to be on overgrazed pasture. So this is a lot of what we see. This is kind of why we got into the memorandum of understanding, and we're even going to talk about how this can lead to muddy conditions and some of the negative side effects of that as well here. So here's some pros and cons of continuous grazing. Pros, it's easy to implement, right? Only the boundary fence is needed. And then the horses have room to exercise. And again, for people like me who are really interested in the 4 F's or 3 F's of happy horses, you know, that freedom to move is a real big thing. I've never ridden a fancy horse, but I've never kept a horse in the stall either. I have a hard time with that concept unless you really needed it for some high energy competition or something. Horses are made to move. Now, having a stall that the horse can come and go into on their own, I think that's a pretty neat thing. But I'm not judging anybody either. It's up to you how you want to manage your land and the horse, at least in Missoula County, with a few exceptions. So yeah, those are a couple pros. Now, what are the bad things? What are the cons of this continuous grazing? Forage isn't given a chance to rest. So you can see in this picture, you know, the ground's unraveling. The organic layer is basically gone because the roots are so small, thin. Soil is constantly trampled, and this can lead to compaction. You can get parasite infections often in this continuously grazed land. Toilet areas won't be eaten. As we mentioned, here's a manure pile. That's not really what we're talking about, but there's no chance for natural seeding because the grass never gets to that point. So that could be something you work into your management plan where you want the reseeding naturally. Some of our pastures are rhizomatous, meaning they grow from the roots. So there's different ways for plants to grow, but there's a lack of biodiversity often because palatable forage species will be eaten first. And if that continues to happen, they will be reduced on the landscape in the pasture, in this case, in the paddock. And the other ones that aren't as palatable will have a chance to grow. So that's why you drive by sometimes and see these fields where there's 24/7 access, there's nothing but weeds and bare dirt. And then, anything like around a water trough or a gateway are likely to be totally bare. And this is often associated with non-point source pollution, which we'll talk about a little bit more because they have compacted soils and they almost become that impervious area that we were talking about. So let's keep going. What else is out there? Here's a picture where we're just saying that overgrazed pasture grasses are very stressed. It is another side effect that can be a big con depending on your horse. And when a grass is stressed, it takes its carbohydrates and sugars again, and stores them at the very bottom of the blade. The root's ready to make new grass as soon as it can, as soon as it gets rest. So all you have in an overgrazed pasture is the bottom part of the blade, and that's a very sugar-rich piece of grass. That's one reason why a lot of times if there's a choice between tall grass and overgrazed grass in the same pasture, the horse will go back to the sugary low grass, but that's not good for them. That can lead again to laminitis or other metabolic issues. So one way people deal with that is to develop confinement areas or sacrifice areas. These are designated spaces where the horse is kept that concentrate their impacts into this confined area while giving pasture time to rest. So if you wanted to let your horse out in a continuous grazing environment or not, in a paddock or pasture that had just one fence, then you'd want to at the very least have a sacrifice area. So maybe you gave them that 3 hours twice a day, something like that. Horses tend to graze in a natural environment, or whether they have free choice, about 3 hours before they do something else, like look for water or take a nap. But 3-hour grazing periods are sort of a natural turnover time. So sometimes these are known as dry lots, and they're really good tools because you can get a lot of compaction in this area, as we just talked about. So you sacrifice this bit of land to say, okay, there's nothing I can do. I can't keep the grass healthy unless you want to use a stall. And then you're really confining the horse to such a small area that you're probably using stall mats and bedding and all that good stuff. And again, not judging if that's you, but we're not even really visiting that in this talk. So confinement areas are a real big tool when it comes to sustainable pasture management. They're needed. And we'll talk more about how to manage these areas later too. So, as we talk about grazing management, I think, as we begin to explore the options, it's kind of a given that most people, not everybody, have been turned on to or introduced to the concepts of rotational grazing, excuse me. So rotational grazing means moving your horse into a fenced area or secluded area while giving another area time to rest. So you're rotating them from one pasture to another pasture before grazing them on it again. It's a key pest management practice in grazing management. And it's extremely important to protect the soil and provide healthy forage by managing your pastures well. So in this example, this person has a sacrifice area and then 3 different pastures. So they start on one, and this is early spring, so the grass is pretty low. But typically the grass is a lot higher in these 3, and they put the horses out for about 3 hours, and then the rest of the time they're in a sacrifice area. So that's basic. This is actually fairly good rotational grazing for, I mean, I would say very good rotational grazing for horse management. You do see this too with cattle management. It's very similar, just much bigger pastures. You know, we'll put them on the North 40 and then the South 40 and then move them over here. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the changes in cattle management too, but horses and cattle aren't the same animals. So as we move from just traditional rotational grazing, we get into what's starting to be known as adaptive grazing, also known as regenerative grazing. So these focus on those regenerative agriculture principles. Adaptive grazing is the practice that involves careful control of livestock densities and the duration. The duration, that's particularly important. A particular pasture is grazed. It's an adjustable grazing practice, and it's based on what's happening in the environment. So it's not a management plan that you stick to. It's a lot of observation, because things change in the wild. You might have a drought year, you might have a high water year. All sorts of things are happening. And then you look for the environmental feedback, and you do that rather than just follow that a rigid protocol. So adaptive grazing thrives on frequent decision making, meaning you're revisiting the land. You really need to have a connection with the land, making, looking for the base conditions here and adjustments in animal impact, not only animal numbers. So you don't just say, well, this piece can hold X number of head, I'll throw it out there, and based on the calculations, that'll be fine for the next 60 days. You really need to look at animal numbers and the impacts they're having. But also you're using the livestock as a tool to manage the forage, maybe stimulate regrowth and potentially build soil health. And I didn't get into that in this talk too much, but the manure of the animal, especially cows, and their feet working that in with hay or grass as they trample it can really rebuild those soils and be beneficial to the soil community as long as it's given time to rest. So this is the introduction to what's being now termed adaptive grazing. And I guess I'll just back up here. It's hard to see, but there's some pigtails here, and you can see there's kind of a line of high grass and low grass. And so these cows are actually only in an area that's a strip in this case, and they move it frequently so that they're eating the tall grass, but the grass that's left behind, you can look in between these two cows in the front, it's still pretty long, and they'll be on different grass probably the next day. So here's a slide I borrowed from my friend Corey Miller at Grass Valley Farms, located in the Missoula Valley. It talks more about adaptive management, adaptive paddock grazing. So we're looking at stock density rather than stocking rate. That means, looking at pounds per acre more than head per acre. Again, it's based more on the impact management. Flexibility is key, frequent movement, and adequate rest. That adequate rest is so important. And the old adage of take half, leave half. So no really leads to no root zone change. And that's where that 50% we were talking about earlier needs to be maintained. And basically Corey's slide is the same as the slide I provided earlier with the change in what's happening with the root regeneration based on those times or amount overgrazed and then less resting time. You need less rest if you can leave it longer. If it's short, you might need a year for that soil to really rebuild. It can be a long time. Here's a slide that I borrowed from the pasture project, talking about adaptive grazing, sort of breaking it down. So we have that continuous grazing we talked about, just a border fence, no move, no rest. There's water in that. Then more typical rotational grazing, more like the one I showed you before, where you maybe move the animals every week. In this case, they have divided their pasture into 4 pieces, and they have water in each one, and they move it, and some rest period is provided for the paddock, but it's pretty rigid. And then we are looking at the adaptive model up here on the right. So you could be moving the animals once a day, or some people do it even more. At our Western Grazing and Ag Conference, we had Glenn Zinga speak as a keynote speaker, and he talked about how he moves his cattle across their very big ranch and rangeland that they lease sometimes, and that they're not driving the cattle, but they do keep people on horseback, and they keep the cows constantly walking and moving. And some of these models are based on the concepts that came out of the buffalo crossing the plains. They didn't stay in one spot. There was sort of a wave of them coming, and they just kept moving in an area and slowly walking. And so that's how Glenn keeps his cows moving as he grazes them. Another keynote speaker from the Western Grazing and Ag Conference here in Missoula was Bart Morris of Oxbow Cattle Company, and he's big on using electric fence and making very small cells. And one of the things that happens in these small cells is the livestock is encouraged to eat everything in the cell and really hit that area pretty hard. And so they eat the less palatable or less desirable plants too, just because there's not that much. And then you let that area rest for a long time. And then, again, with cattle particularly, the manure distribution is spread throughout the cell and gets worked into the soil. Horses less desirable for different reasons, but some things to learn from adaptive grazing or adaptive management, which is being used in the cattle industry quite a bit. Here's same pasture project, Wallace Center. They show on the left, we have continuous grazing, zero rest. You can see that the soil biology indicated by those little worms is not very diverse. The root depth isn't great. Soil compaction is leading to water standing on the ground. So then we get into typical rotational grazing where each square area of the pasture maybe is rested 75% of the time and grazed 25% of the time. You get better root depth, you have more biodiversity, better soil health. The other thing this is trying to indicate is that top brown layer, the A horizon, is really growing. And I think that gray area is supposed to show the living root community. And then adaptive grazing, where a piece of land is really rested about 95% of the time. It's going to vary depending on what you have to work with and number of animals. And again, what your goals are, it's up to you. But lots of rest, lots of biodiversity, maybe some other plants that have larger tap roots that really can bust up old compacted soil, because a lot of us aren't having a clean slate to work with to begin with. We're taking over other people's mismanagement. And then a really thriving, living soil biology. And that's just so good at getting you nitrogen and other nutrients that the plants need to grow without you having to go to your local feed store and buy a big bag of supplements. Fencing doesn't have to be extreme for these adaptive management techniques. And again, these are cows, but I've seen people use the same technique with horses. So a little solar charger and some pigtails, you can move your animals around pretty quickly and easily. I did promise after showing all these cattle examples that I would talk just a minute about how horses and cows are different. So horses are close grazers. You can use their incisors and they'll take that grass way down. They tend to graze selectively and return to their favorite spots, those short spots often too, where all the sugar is. And they create lawns and roughs, those areas where the manure is, or for whatever reason they don't want to go. And you kind of see that back of that picture there. And then cows, are tongue grazers. They wrap their tongue around the plant, they pull it in, and then they munch it up. They're less precise on horses as far as what they eat. So they are better in those adaptive management areas as far as eating weeds. You can kind of teach cows to eat things. Like a lot of people say they don't like spotted knapweed, but they can learn to. I've talked to plenty of ranchers who are like mine do. They're more efficient grazers. And part of that is the cow's a ruminant, right? It has a 4-chambered stomach. And so it can eat lower quality food and it takes longer to digest it. And then horses are hindgut fermenters, one stomach. They're less efficient at digesting. They require higher quality forage to meet their needs, but both need a lot of fiber. And so they're different animals, but there's a lot of overlap and similarities that apply in grazing management. So, all right, we're going to use some sort of adaptive management or something a little different than just normal rotational grazing. What else is out there? There's single fence strip grazing. So here's where you have a fence across. The bottom black line is just showing that most of the paddocks fenced off. And then the horses are kept to this starting paddock and they eat away. Then after week 1, you move the fence over. So now there's a new strip of green grass and the horses move to it. But they can also still go back to the old area. And they might do that in search of those low sugary grasses. And so you just proceed down the field, week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. What it doesn't do, well, let's go in the pros and cons. So the pros, it controls the amount of pasture provided. Yeah, you have some control. It allows some of the paddock to rest. Newer grasses are restricted. So the intake is slow, especially again for those metabolic horses or horses prone to overgrazing, and it gives fresh pasture regularly. The horses do need all that fiber that comes with those longer grasses. It's really good for them. The hard part is the con, only one electric, that's not a con, that should be a pro. Only one electric fence piece of equipment is moved. I guess that's a pro or con. It's really probably a pro as far as how easy it is. But it is more labor intensive because you're moving fencing fairly frequently every week. So you have to have some fence that you can move along, like the electric fence I showed before. And then horses may go back and graze that short grass, as we talked about. And I got this from Inside Out Hoof Care. So here's some strip grazing examples. I don't remember where I got this slide. I apologize to whoever I took it from. Strip grazing is a form of adaptive grazing that involves fencing off small areas of pasture and regularly moving the fencing to allow access to the fresh green grass. This method can control grass intake, manage weight, allow pastures to rest and recover. I think I probably should have had that slide before the last one. So here's dual fence strip grazing. This is a lot different. So here what we're doing, let's just start on week one. You have your one fence just like the other. So the horses are behind grazing in that area that says grazing. It's a little darker green. And then the other pasture is resting. So now when you move the one fence down and you're going to allow the horses to move onto that fresh grass, you're also fencing them out of the area they were last. So it takes two fences. So you can see week two, we're moving, week 3 and 4 gradually getting down, but they're not allowed to go back to that area they always were before. So, you know, the pros and cons, it greatly limits pasture provided to the horse and lets that other pasture rest longer. Newer grasses are restricted. So grazing is introduced slowly for the horse's system, those sugary grasses again, and horses with metabolic issues. You can't just throw them out on green pasture necessarily. Horses are given fresh pasture regularly. That's plus with both of them. Minimize selective grazing. They're not allowed to return, and or you know, you're keeping them sort of confined to a smaller area, so they're forced to eat what's there, and that could be something as long as it's not toxic that you might want them to get rid of. And yeah, just overall minimizes overgrazing, gives resting pasture a true time to rest. Cons, you're going to need more fencing equipment. Now you need 2 lines of portable fence. It's doable, but it's just more labor intensive than you're moving fence and possibly water to. The horses are kept in a smaller area. So as far as that freedom to move, their area is limited. So that could be a drawback if you really want your horse to be galloping around for exercise and playing with their buddies. So then there's kind of a new, Jamie Jackson is the first person I heard talk about this. He wrote a book called Pasture Paradise. You can look it up. But track systems, it's basically 2 fences. And so you can have the horses kept on a track. So your sacrifice area is essentially a track. And then the pasture is on the inside of the track. I have not personally tried this, but it fits with the model that I'm looking for that freedom of movement, and in fact, encouraging movement. So some of the pros here, movement, especially on smaller paddocks. So you're saying like, how do I keep my acre? I've seen this on as small as an acre and have any pasture when I have 2 horses. Well, you could have a track system around the edge and not let them on the center except for 3 hours a day and or whatever you can handle. You're going to have to watch the grass. But in the meantime, it also encourages them not to just stand in the corner and eat hay. A lot of people sprinkle hay around the track system. That's one way you can work it, or put hay bags on different parts. So it increases exercise and that mental enrichment that's so important for horses. Horses are pretty smart animals, and they like to be figuring things out, even though they're spooky and prey species, reactive animals. This can incorporate different elements if you want to. People get pretty fancy with this. They put in little slopes. They'll put in logs or something, again, for mental enrichment. They also change the surface. A lot of people harden their track system. A lot of people, barefoot horse people, are into this, and barefoot horse people like their horses to have time on gravel. So if you want to add gravel to this, it can be really beneficial. If you're in Western Montana, you may have a site that provides rocky, gravelly flooring. We had someone speak on the system at the Western Grazing and Ag Conference a few years ago. They lived over by Helena, and they didn't put anything down for a track, aggregate down because they did live on a rocky area. So those things can be incorporated. And then, it's just good for the horse to keep moving. So there was one research paper that showed that the horse moved twice as much on the track system. It was 1.4 miles a day to over 3 miles a day. Jamie Jackson spent a long time observing wild Mustangs and talks about how much they move around. And, that's one reason that their feet are tough. And he was also looking at horses in Nevada. So that's a little different and there's benefits to that. But this isn't a horse foot talk, so we're going to keep moving. The cons against this, some of the hard part is you need basically twice as much fencing. And, if you want to add aggregate to it, that's expensive too. So there's some expensive things here. And then the sacrifice area, it can actually be cumulatively a larger part of your acreage, especially if you have small acreage. Well, either one probably changes proportionately the bigger your track system is, because if you have a really giant track system, you're going to have a lot of area in the track, and you probably wouldn't have allocated that much area to sacrifice area. Then just one caution. So you have this pasture in the middle. Again, depending on the size, if you're on 1 acre lot, you want to divide it somehow, or watch it. But anyway, it goes, you have a pasture to manage in the middle. So you're still going to have to incorporate this with some of those other techniques we talked about, like strip grazing. So I like this system, and it's pretty new. So I'm going to share a few more examples than maybe with the other systems. This is a track system I visited in the Bitterroot Valley, which is just south of Missoula, Montana, where our offices are located. I put a black line on the track because it's kind of hard to see here. So they actually hayed their other 2 pastures because their horses really couldn't be on pasture very much at all. And then they had a very small pasture they turned their horses out on, the very bottom left corner of the picture. And then this track system had a sacrifice area included with a barn. So the horses might be in that sacrifice area, and the landowner could come out of their home, get hay from their barn and throw it on the track, and the horses would then go out and walk the track and come back down. So interesting system there. I talked about the cost of fencing and how the fencing basically doubles. Well, that's not necessarily true. You can get away with an interior fence depending on your horse and what other kind of animals are around in your pasture, like livestock or wildlife. Sometimes we have elk jumping into pastures around here, or moose just bullying their way in. So that can make people want a pretty substantial exterior fence. But the interior fence doesn't need to be as substantial. You could even use those pigtails and electric fence I showed earlier. And then some people add gravel, and that can help reduce mud too. You still have to do your normal maintenance of the track system because it is your sacrifice area. And we're about to get to managing sacrifice areas and pasture. Here's that same pasture, and partly because this landowner, I think I told you, had metabolic horses, they didn't want them on too much pasture at all. So they thought that little pasture they had was already too much grass for their horses to have a day. So they were going to put in fenced islands of trees and shrubs. Now, this is kind of the approach I've taken in the past because I'm also a wildlife guy and just recognize native species diversity and richness as being important. So I always wanted to provide habitat in my horse pasture. If someone gave me 40 acres in Missoula, Montana right now, and it had trees on it and other things, and I had the ability to turn it into a flat piece of grass pasture, I couldn't bring myself to do that. I would want to keep some of those trees or shrubs and other things to provide the habitat that should naturally be here. Again, that's up to you, but it's one of the things that I think is really neat about a track system. And here is a picture. I don't remember where I got the one on the left, but you can see there's pollinator habitat. Here at the Missoula Conservation District, we've been working to promote pollinator habitat since 2018, I think is when we started our campaign. NRCS has a similar campaign nationally. The National Association of Conservation Districts and Montana Association of Conservation Districts have campaigns for that. So back to the one on the right is the one up the Bitterroot. That's what you say locally. It's up the Bitterroot because you're going up the drainage, even though it's south where you think you're going down the Bitterroot. Semantics. So these are a lot of native plants and non-toxic plants they have just in case, but you can see they even have their track system, their pasture, and then another exterior fence just to keep other things out and separate their driveway and the road. So their track system fencing really isn't much at all, but there's a lot of habitat provided there. This is a picture I grabbed off the web too, and I can't remember where I got this one. Um, Incorporating, different habitats and environmental elements near the track system or in the track system, like it looks like there's a water gap here, can really provide a lot of mental enrichment that's so important to horses. And it's one of the things I really like about it. Even having that sort of element just on the other side of the fence, I believe, is really helpful for the horses and just getting them used to birds they might see out on the trail or something like that. There could be a deer with a fawn or maybe a fox den, and whatever you're in the mood to tolerate. Um, they'll have more exposure to that. And I think that's great for horses, not to mention providing the biodiversity that's so important for our natural environment. Because all these things, just like the soil, um, they all provide ecosystem services. So filtering of water, providing nutrients, just cooling of the ground temperature, storing of water. The ground is a big sponge, so a lot of people, we do a lot with river restoration and river management. And what people don't realize is that area that floods, I'm not talking a 100-year flood event, but on a local high water event that comes in, and that saturates all the soil next to the bank. And then slowly the groundwater is always moving towards that low point in the river. Sometimes the river is actually moving towards the groundwater, it depends on the site, but quite often your water's coming down the slope, moving through, and eventually, the river is going down perpendicular to the groundwater, and the groundwater taps in and starts recharging that, as well as the what we call overland flow from melting snow and stuff like that, when the water is actually moving across the surface of the land. But it's always going through the land, and it's cold, clean water usually. So those are other ecosystem services that can be provided by having more habitat. This is another picture I grabbed off the web somewhere. I think I went on one of the track system pages, maybe on Facebook, but this is a pretty big one. And I just wanted to show the scale that this can be done. People are using it. The other thing I was thinking, if I were going to create a track system, I might not make it a full connected track, because then you could have your hay, like this feeder, on the left or downward side of the barn be on one side, so you could feed hay there, and then you could have a gate closing the track, and on the other side of the barn provide water. So now when the horse, after eating at the hay feeder, wants water, it has to go all around the track to get it, and back, and not right through the middle. So that's one place you can have one center area to work for from at your mothership there. One area you keep your hay and tools, facility, barn usually is what we think of. But I've been seeing people just kind of have a mobile trailer to work with some of this adaptive management. They keep everything on a trailer, and they don't even have a barn anymore. They might have a tack room, but as far as moving their horses around, they have a trailer that has their fencing equipment, some other things, and they save hundreds of thousands of dollars that way. So anyway, this is a larger industrial, farm track system. All right, so one of the things I want to talk about is what happens with bad management, poor management of the horses, which again was sort of the catalyst when I drive around with the supervisors of the Missoula Conservation District, or the biologists I work with at the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and they all know I'm a horse guy. Sometimes we pass properties and they say, "Oh, there's one of your buddies," and it'll be, the whole property looks like a sacrifice area. It's overgrazed, it's muddy, it's filled with weeds, soils are compacted, and so out of those areas come what we call non-point source pollutants. So unlike a point source, which is pipe coming out of a factory, let's say there's a fire factory and there's a pipe coming out and there's some nasty chemicals coming out of it and it drains right into a river, that would be a point source. You could point to the source of the contamination. It's all coming right from the end of this pipe, which we know is coming out of the factory. A non-point source pollutant comes from diffuse sources. So it's here and there and everywhere, and it's really hard to say this is where it comes from. It's just cumulative across the landscape. It occurs when rainfall or snowfall melts and moves across the ground. So that's what we call overland flow in ecology. But water is moving across the ground, and it picks up natural and human-made pollutants, and it carries them into your rivers or your lakes or your wetlands, or even percolates down into the groundwater and can get into wells and stuff like that. So common non-point source pollutants can be excessive fertilizer that plants can't pick up, and they're herbicides too, or insecticides and even fungicides from agricultural fields or residential yards. And just so you know, residential yards across America, let me back up. Herbicides, fungicides, insecticides are all categorized as pesticides. So you tend to think about pesticides as insecticides, getting a pest, but people find those things all to be pests. So pesticides coming off of the neighborhood yard are 10 times as great as what we get off of agricultural fields. So when you hear people talking about, oh, I need to buy organic because there's all these things used on our foods, and so much of that goes into the rivers, and that's why we have regenerative agriculture, to help to combat some of that waste of inputs and those wasted inputs entering our landscape, not to mention non-natural substances. Um, the accumulation off of our residential land is tenfold what it is on our monocultural industrial agriculture. So also we have sediment from poorly managed construction sites or forest lands or other places that are eroding. We have salts from irrigation practices or acid drainage and metal contaminations from abandoned mines. There can be bacteria and nutrients from livestock or even pet waste, right? You're supposed to pick up off your dog. Not to mention your failing septic system. So those would all be considered non-point source pollutions. They're just kind of oozing out all over, and they get into our streams and groundwater and whatnot. Even stormwater, which can then lead to streams in Montana, certainly in our Missoula community. So this whole situation is exacerbated when vegetation that protects the soil is removed or greatly reduced, right? When you combine that with the compaction from the hoof, the 1,000-pound plus animal on these hard rock-like hooves, compacting the ground, the ability for that ground to absorb water is greatly reduced. And you can think about a sponge or a brick. If you have all that porosity in your soil that we talked about before, you have a sponge. If you have all the compaction, you have a brick. If you're going to pour water on top of them, the sponge will absorb water. The brick won't. So the brick becomes an impervious surface, or the brick is an impervious surface. So that can lead to mud, especially when you do have a big impervious surface like a roof or a driveway or a parking lot, God forbid, right next to your pasture. I'm talking like a blacktop one, an industrial one. So if you have those hard impervious surfaces, then the surface flow that would otherwise sink into those areas is just passed on to your area where it's already compacted. And so if the manure, especially if the manure hasn't recently been picked up, you can have mud that forms really quickly and passes through and carries these harmful non-point source pollutants. Not sure if you knew this, but a horse can produce 40 to 50 pounds of manure a day and 2.5 to 4 gallons of urine per day. So that's a lot of waste and liquid just from the horse itself. Exposed soils and urine and manure all create mud together. Mud can harbor bacteria. I mean, bacteria in the soil can be good, but there's certain bacteria that are made to feed on living flesh of horses. So you can get rain rot and other things, contribute to hoof and skin issues. Certainly the frog, a horse. I think one reason that wild horses have better hooves is because they don't have to step in their own manure and have that bacteria introduced. And they're actually, wild horses are pretty conscious of manure. That's one reason wild stallions will leave stud piles to mark their territory, where a lot of our horses kept in smaller confinement areas have lost their sensitivity to walking through their own manure and can often get that bacteria in their hooves. So the mud contains contaminants, and that can leach into the groundwater again or run off in the stream. So a well-managed horse paddock and pasture create healthy soils and cleaner water. And ultimately, it's not just for the environment, but it's for our horses and possibly our own health too. Here's one of the more tragic things that we can see is runoff from these properties, as we just talked about, that carry these contaminants, the nutrients, the organics, and microbial pathogens as non-point source pollutants, and then right into a stream that without a real adequate vegetated buffer. This is a stream we're looking at. It actually is allowed, it's a very small stream, but it's allowed to grow right on the stream. So you don't see a defined channel there, but which is a good thing in this case. But that fence is pretty close to the stream. There's not a good riparian buffer there. And so these non-point source pollutants associated with horses often include, phosphorus, salts, ammonium nitrate, and disease-causing organisms like E. coli and Salmonella. Um, and can lead to giardia or contain giardia. So unhealthy for humans and horses alike. And these substances may be transported again into lakes and streams or just go right down into the groundwater and contaminate our wells. Overall, non-point source pollution significantly degrades water quality, and the runoff from stables and ranches is often associated with non-point source pollutants. So what have we learned so far? We learned that, minimally we want to put a horse on when the grass is, 8 inches tall, 6 to 8 inches, and we want to get them off there, 5 to 4 inches. So we want to be grazing on taller grasses. And what does this do? It cools the soil, it shields the soil, it leads into those things we were talking about, the principles of soil health, what we need to do to protect the soil. And then we have that microbial environment and all this stuff, not only is it feeding itself and cutting down on the inputs we have to put in, which can then be non-point source pollutants if they're not totally utilized by the plant we're trying to feed. They also have the ability to filter out some of that pollution that's naturally occurring. So what other best management practices are out there? And I capitalize best management practices because it's something we talk about in ecology and as land managers a lot, or BMPs you hear. What are the BMPs? Well, here's a really important one. And one thing conservation districts do in Montana is oversee the Montana Natural Streambed Land Preservation Act of 1975. So most conservation districts, and conservation districts are in just about every county in America, again, coming out of the Dust Bowl. Most of them focus on cost sharing programs or education, sometimes volunteer management. But in Montana, we do all that, and we have regulatory authority of activities along streams. So if you wanted to build your house right along a stream, you would need to get what we call 310 permit. If depending on the conservation district and their administrative codes, the law doesn't have a set setback to it. It just says if you're doing something that impacts the stream and the immediate banks of the stream, then the conservation district board can take jurisdiction over that activity. So here in Missoula County, one of the things we don't want is people mowing their lawns right down to a stream for a bunch of the reasons we've already talked about. That don't just apply to horses, they apply to, if you see humans too, if you see a green lawn with no dandelions right up to a stream, you can bet those people are pouring lots of fertilizers on, more than the lawn can probably utilize. So when you get a rain event, you do have that overland flow, and that stormwater carrying phosphorus or nitrogen goes into the stream. Same thing with the herbicide. So no dandelions, no weeds. What's happening there? There's a lot of herbicide that gets swept into the stream. So these riparian buffers actually provide the ecosystem service of filtering some of that stormwater off. The interesting thing about the Montana Natural Streambed and Land Preservation Act is it excludes livestock and farm management from the regulation. So you might not be able to mow your lawn down to a stream, but you could have your horse graze down to the stream, not to mention walk in and out of the stream and potentially, erode the stream bank. So one of the best management practices we like to see is providing an voluntarily unmanaged riparian buffer. I think in Oregon and other places, it might be required by law. But in Montana, this would be a voluntary practice. Fenced off riparian buffer and riparian areas are the areas where sort of there's a transitional ecosystem function from water to upland. Here you can see in this picture, there's a bunch of cottonwoods along this creek, and cottonwoods need water to survive. You don't see them up on the hills around there. So if you put up a riparian fence, and permitting might be needed, so we might let grazing practices don't apply to the law in Montana, but building a structure such as a fence does. So you might need a 310 permit for this, or there might be other local zoning ordinances wherever you are, floodplain ordinances, you just have to check. But building a fence and keeping your animals out of the creek, if you want to have a water gap, that's a good practice. And another thing that could be funded by your conservation district or maybe NRCS or other conservation organizations that do cost sharing programs. So certainly if you're in Missoula County and you're watching this, reach out to us and see what sort of programs you might be eligible for. And I'm just looking at the notes on the slide. I think I covered that without reading it to you. So riparian buffers are just so important. I couldn't say enough about them. Manure management, right? We got to pick up our manure kind of frequently. If you're in a sacrifice area more frequently, and it's easier, frankly, because it's easier to pick up manure when it's just lying on a parking lot of dirt, essentially, or an area denuded of vegetation. It's easier to see, it's easier to scoop up, but it's also more important because you don't have that soil biology working to eat it, those plants trying to consume it. So you pick that up and you pile it. This is a pretty ideal facility here. And again, something that could be eligible for a cost sharing program depending on where you are. But this has a cement slab on the bottom so that contaminated water coming out of the manure pile won't soak right down into the groundwater and contaminate it. It has a wall. It actually has 2 bins, so you can get your tractor in there and turn over a pile and then start a new pile that hasn't been turned over. It's really important when you're decomposing manure to make sure it has proper oxygen. Some people stick PVC pipes in and then pull them out to put channels for air to get down into that. The turnover is really important as well. You want to make sure your manure pile is at least 100 feet away from your wellhead or any open water source, just because there could be contamination. To make sure there's not contamination, this tarp, or I've seen people use canvas, placed over the top of a manure pile helps with that. It also, helps to keep the moisture that's in the manure and the moisture that's coming down not in the manure and running off into the groundwater. You want your manure wet, but you want it to be sort of the consistency of a wrung out sponge. So it's wet to the touch, it's moist, but it's not dripping and contaminating the groundwater. So these are all things that are best management practices when it comes to manure storage. And then this manure will reduce by about 50% in size as it decomposes. It'll give off some heat too. And then it's ready to spread. And you can spread, an inch or so back on a pasture that's resting, and it can really help to build up that organic layer and that A horizon soil. Here's another one, gutters or rain barrels. There's no rain barrel here, but you can see the gutter, and then it goes right into a piece of PVC, which is actually buried under the sacrifice area and drains outside of the horse area altogether. So, we talked about impervious surfaces like a roof, and that can significantly increase all the water that comes down, because the water that would otherwise be absorbed is now concentrated, right? So 1 inch of water over each part of that roof is now concentrated to where it drips off. And if your gutter just goes out into your sacrifice area, you have a whole lot of water pumped right in to the sacrifice area, leading to the mud and those potential non-point source pollutants we were talking about earlier. So getting that out, another way a lot of people do it is by installing rain barrels, so you can actually save that water and use it later. In the Missoula Valley, we get about 17 inches of water a year, so water's pretty precious. I didn't go into irrigation and agricultural diversions in this talk, but yeah, saving your water and using it for something else is not a bad idea. And then rain barrels can be funded by a lot of different sources. I always see not-for-profit organizations like MUD in Missoula that have rain barrel workshops where you can get a subsidized rain barrel that you put together yourself. So good best management practices, or now that you know, BMPs for managing some of that runoff and that would be coming off impervious surfaces. Swales are another one. I didn't really get into that here, but if you had a parking lot and a pasture, you might want to put a divot in the ground. These can be called rain gardens or swales. The runoff runs there. Those are places you want to plant with plants that are able to tolerate a lot of rain. And the more vegetation in there, often the better, because they will drink that water instead of letting it percolate down into the ground. So that's another way to filter out, consume non-point source pollutants as they come off an impervious surface. So we're shooting for having a horse happy out there with grazing away on good tall grasses, and it's just good for him. It's what they're meant to do. It's what they're meant to be. I mentioned earlier that sometimes we get a property that's already been hammered, or maybe we hammered it and we say it's time to reset it. Well, a lot of people will disc up their land, and when that happens, you're sort of violating one of those principles of soil health. You're removing that armor, as I mentioned before. You're introducing those biology, the microorganisms and other things, to ultraviolet light and oxygen, and just an environment that they haven't been exposed to. You can really, a lot of people will do this and to try to control weeds or something. And depending if you have a rhizominous or root growing type of a plant you're trying to get rid of, this can actually stimulate the growth. So like a quackgrass, if you went in and did this to quackgrass, chances are you're just going to spread the quackgrass and it will grow through this. So, you know, it can be a bad idea. Now, a lot of people say, well, wait, but my property has been very compacted, so I need to disc it before I plant, or this is the way I want it. I need to get new grass seed in. It's mostly not grass seed anymore. So how do I get the plants I want planted if I don't till it? So let's talk about tilling for a minute. Well, you can get what's called a plow pan. So that disc only goes down so far. Like, let's look again. What is that? I don't know, maybe 4 to 6 inches of depth from where the blade would actually penetrate into the ground. So if you look here, this is showing compact soil under the ground. So you disc up the first 6 inches, but the compaction, depending on what did it, let's say it was a dump truck or had one landowner I've been working with where they had the Forest Service camp out, hundreds and hundreds of people and equipment, helicopters and water trucks, all in their hayfield while they fought a wildfire. And it was wonderful service they provided by letting the Forest Service do that. And the Forest Service, was helpful in compensating them for the damage done. But now they have compacted soil. So what do? Well, disking it, you don't necessarily get rid of the problem. So you have that sealed pores or perched water table on a plow pan or disc pan. And you're really not changing the situation. In order to do that, you'd either have to get something like a backhoe to go down and really dig deep and break up the land. Or what a lot of people use is a companion crop. Some people call it, what am I trying to say? Well, I'm just going to say companion crop. I'm glad that I've trained myself to forget the other term. But the companion crop that has a larger taproot. Some indications that you may have soil that's compacted is, you can't grow anything but thistle, which has a great big taproot, and you're wondering why. Well, maybe after a while, after the thistle gets down and breaks up some of these pans, you'll be able to go in and plant something more desirable, and the soil will be ready. But anyway, there's things you want to do before you start disking your soil and wrecking it and violating one of those principles of soil health. So what can you do? Well, here at the Missoula Conservation District, we own a no-till drill, which is a kind of seeder, and we rent that. Here's the contact info on this slide. So you can rent that in a trailer and pull it behind your tractor. And what that does is it plants directly into turf so that a field, let's say your field was horribly overgrazed and has a lot of weeds and you want to get the seed in, but you don't want to violate the principles of soil health. Well, take a peek at this next slide and look. So the no-till drill slices open the turf, drops the seed down about, I think it's about 2 inches. It can be changed actually, and then sort of seals it back up with those wheels. And so you're left with just little strips of sort of disturbed soil and seeds planted in there. So the regeneration, it's been proven regeneration is a lot. It's more, what am I trying to say here? It's beneficial. We have better regeneration and seed success in here. There's more water storage capacity than if you plowed your land. You still have that microbial community, which is thriving. Not to mention, if you're broadcast seeding over tilled soil, you got to deal with all the critters that come in and see that. You get a flock of juncos passing through and all your seed is gone, or a lot of it are turkeys or whatever you have in your area. Ringneck pheasant, ringneck doves eat a lot of seed in this area. So anyway, the no-till drill can be great for restoration. So that's pretty much it today. I guess, I just want to stress that we all love our horses, but it's important for us and for the health of our animals and for the health of the environment that we implement these best management practices, and that we, practice environmental stewardship as we're taking care of our land. And in that way, we can not only take care of our animals and take care of our land, we can take care of our water and avoid non-point source pollutants coming off our ranches, which is the last thing we want to do as we represent ourselves in the horse community. This is just pictures of my family enjoying horses over the years. So, I really need to thank the partners that have stepped up to partner with the Missoula Conservation District and make this project possible. Remind you again that we do have this no-till drill available here at the Missoula Conservation District. That's available to surrounding counties as well. But this whole project was funded by the Montana through a grant through the Montana Association of Conservation Districts. And indirectly, that grant money was provided to the Montana Association of Conservation Districts through a grant from the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, or DEQ. And indirectly, that money came from the federal government, from the EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency. So nationwide, the Environmental Protection Agency oversees the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act. And then, usually most of that responsibility is passed on to each state. In this case, DEQ is the agency in the state of Montana that would look after those regulations. And, regulations is never the best part of anybody's life. It's kind of the safety net for when we either haven't learned an environmental ethic, or we've had other things that get in the way and make us forget our environmental ethics. So it's the safety net that steps in and says, enough's enough. This is where we need to change something. So just thank you, partners. Thank you, Montana Association of Conservation District, DEQ, and EPA for making this possible. We've also held a workshop on this topic, and then since given it locally, this talk locally, and produced a bifold. So if you're interested, you can use that same address up there to reach out to the Missoula Conservation District office at missoulacd.org and ask us about that publication, and we can potentially get you copies for your group. Again, just really thank you. Let me know if you have any questions. The contact info is right there. I'm Rad Watkins. I'm the Executive Director of the Missoula Conservation District. You can reach us at office at missoulacd.org and find us online at missoulacd.org. So thanks a lot. Whatever you do with your horses, I hope you have fun, and I hope you practice environmental stewardship, fence off those riparian areas, and let them get out there and move around with a buddy. And I hope you are safe on your horse, and appreciate your stewardship and looking after Montana's resources. Thank you.